Does Apple hold a monopoly on the digital music market? The New York Times is reporting the Justice Department is looking into just that. Fortune's managing editor, Andy Serwer, here to weigh in on all of that. Andy, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Poppy.
Let's go through some of the specifics here, because it looks like the New York Times is the only one that has this, saying sources briefed on those DOJ conversations say the agency's been talking to major music labels about whether or not Apple has asked them to sell their music through Apple Online exclusively. So that's a big question.
Right.
But is there anything wrong with that, if that even is the case?
Well, that's going to be a question for the government, I guess, and the lawyers for Apple. But, when you think about online music from a legal standpoint, purchasing online music, you think about the iTunes Store. And, their market share, depending on who you ask, is anywhere from the high 60s to the low 90s, depending on how you measure things. They're the dominant player. Dominance is okay. The question is, do you use that dominance to unfairly force companies to bend to your will? And I think that's the question. And I think that this particular case, as the New York Times reports, it has to do with Amazon and trying to bend them to the will of Apple.
That's one of the big questions, and what's also in this report is that investigators are looking into some allegations that Apple is using this dominant position, trying to not let competitors like Amazon.com sell the same music or sell it ahead of time or whatnot. But isn't that just doing smart business? Isn't that just kind of what Apple does, being the market leader in a number of sectors? Or, as you've talked about it, they're no longer the underdog.
Yeah, well, that's the point. I mean, listen, and Amazon is a difficult position because, of course, not only are they in a bad spot because of music, but also because of the iPad versus the Kindle. I mean, the Kindle used to be the reader. Now the iPad is the reader. So, they're looking at Apple, which they used to partner with in some ways, and saying this is a company that is out not only to compete with us, but to kill us. And I think you hit upon an interesting point there, Poppy, when you talk about where Apple is today vis-a-vis where it was, say, 10 years ago. Apple always was iconoclastic. It always was all about it's our way or the highway. And that was kind of cute. It was kind of fun when they were this little guy kind of punching and trying to, gain a little market share, low single digits on their computers. But now all of a sudden things have changed dramatically. I mean, they're the dominant player in music. Phones, they're not the dominant player, but they have, a pretty good position there as well. And this new reader business, they could be the dominant player there as well. Has the company been able to change the way it perceives itself in the marketplace? And I think they really need to do that. I'm not sure they really understand that.
What do you think, Andy, in terms of the long-term implications here, whether we look at the Apple-Adobe battle or whether we look at this reported DOJ investigation into Apple and the online music sector? What's the long-term implication here, do you think, for Apple?
Well, I think the long-term implication is that they need to change their mindset. I mean, they need to understand
that they've done so well in this mindset,
well,
right?
But that's right, but you need to change. And, it's so interesting to me hearing over the years Steve Jobs, rail against Microsoft, and then more recently rail against Google for being big, for being clumsy, for not having taste. That was always a big thing for Steve Jobs. They're the big guys who dominate the market, and it's so terrible. And now here Apple is in a position of market dominance, as we said, in many positions. You need to be able to adapt. When your company goes from A to B, you have to change the way you do business.